Sup, boys? So today I want to talk to you all about the corruption vendor that was added today and why I think it's indicative of a larger problem in the game in general. I think it's disrespectful and also demoralizing to players the way that these catch-up mechanisms have been added into the game recently, and I want to explain why I think that is. Now, before I get into anything else, I do want to address the elephant in the room, which is the room. Obviously, I'm not in the treehouse. I recently have cleaned up my old room from whenever I grew up, and I can see the floor, which is more than I could have said for the past 10 years. We've used this basically as a storage room, and so now I have it all cleaned up, and you guys can see my Warcraft 2, Warcraft 1, Super Nintendo, a bunch of little toys there, and 64, tons of stuff you guys can see in the background. So I figured I'd do a video in here and show you guys what's going on. Eventually, one of these days, I'll do a tour, though. Anyway, let's go ahead and get back into the video. First thing I want to talk about is the fact that this corruption vendor was something that people would have wanted to see as soon as the corruption system actually came out. And I think this is fundamentally the crux of my argument and why I think that it's a problem. I think that so often Blizzard has basically withheld catch-up mechanisms or quality of life mechanisms for these systems intentionally in order to drive engagement later on after the interest in them wears off. So, for example, let's say this is engagement, and let's say this is time, okay? So at the top, obviously, whenever the system first comes out, it's going to be at maximum engagement right at the beginning. So then as time goes on, the system goes down, less and less people do it, and right as it hits this threshold, let's say, Blizzard decides, hey, you know what? Not enough people are doing assault dailies, let's add Echoes of Ny'alotha. And so that pushes the engagement a little bit up, a little bit more. Now more people are doing it, and then once they do it enough, then it goes back down a little bit more, and then, oh, wow, another threshold. What happens? Corruption vendor. What a surprise. Now, this is what I think they've been doing, and I also think that it's intentional. Why do I think that it's intentional? Because it's happened a lot. How many times has it happened? It's happened enough to where I couldn't remember as many times, and I actually made a little list here on my tablet, and I want to go ahead and look at some of these little examples of times that Blizzard has withheld an obvious quality of life increase for an arbitrary period of time until people get tired of a system, and then adding it in later on, which then requires players to retrace their own footsteps, or their old footsteps, and then repeat the same exact content that they wanted to stop doing in the first place. So I think number one of the best places for us to start is account-wide essences to begin with. Essences should have been account-wide on release. Nobody wants to farm out 50,000 honor on every single character, and it's not fun to do in any way, shape, or form. So I think this is another example of Blizzard basically knowing that this system is obviously not a good system. I think everybody, even in 8.2 PTR, was providing feedback that this system would be extremely it would be extremely hard to get into with alt. It would be a huge barrier to entry for anybody who wants to make an alt, because now they have to not only, progress through the artifact knowledge system and artifact power system, or is it artifact power? Oh, Azerite power, excuse me, wrong expansion. And on top of that, getting their Azerite gear and all of the other in-game progression systems, but now on top of that, you have essences. So the problem with that is the fact that people were playing in 8.2, and this is an obvious solution that they could have done then, and they withheld it. And I think that they did this intentionally to hold it for later on and then add it later on to make people happy. And I think also the solution of Echoes of Ny'alotha is not very good. I don't like Echoes of Ny'alotha, but I think that it's better than nothing. And this also ties into a general idea that I want to talk about before I get into any more specifics, is the idea that Blizzard players want something, and Blizzard gives them something like what the something that they wanted is like, and then you have people that go and say, and then obviously players aren't happy with it. They're like, well, we didn't want it like this. Like, what the fuck is this? And then Blizzard and Blizzard apologists are like, well, see, you can never make them happy. If you give them what they want, then they just get mad about it. They don't know what they want. I think the problem here is that players do know what they want. I think the fact is that players have known what they've wanted ever since the systems have been released. Players have known that the legendary system in Legion was going to be a fucking disaster before it even got implemented onto Alpha. And the problems that people predicted at that point on release, on the announcement of the system, were the case for multiple patches inside of the game's release. And the idea that the players don't know what they want is not true at all. The problem is that Blizzard gives the players what Blizzard wants the players to want and not actually what the players want. And I think really the problem here is that the decisions that are being made with participation and not enjoyment in mind. So instead of actually looking at how many people are actually enjoying a system and playing it out of fun, they're just looking at how many people are interfacing with the system as a raw metric and not necessarily looking at the nuance behind that and seeing how those individuals are interacting with it and what their enjoyment level is of it. For example, there's plenty of people who did their garrison farm. I don't think anybody enjoyed it, though. Nobody really had fun doing it. Participation is not success, and I think Blizzard bases a lot of their decisions off of participation being equated to success because of the way that their metrics are used and the way that they use them to make decisions with the game. Now, obviously, this is my opinion, and I want to say that there's nobody at Blizzard that's told me this or anything like that. This is just me inferring things based off of my experience playing the game, but after you see the same thing happen, let's see, probably like over a dozen times, it kind of, there's a pattern. There's a pattern, guys. And so account-wide essences is number one. Number two is corruption vendor. And the reason why this is a problem is at this point, almost everybody has gotten done playing 8.3. Everybody, for the most part, that's come back for the patch has done everything that they've wanted to do. And they've had to suffer through this incomplete and unfun and unfair system for months now. And Blizzard coming in here with a fix, acting like they're saving the day, is the last thing that I want to see. These releases, these systems have to be in on release. I'm sick of beta testing a system that's clearly unfun and clearly dysfunctional, and that's evident by everybody that's tested it on the beta and the alpha and the PTR, and it goes live anyway, and then I think Blizzard intentionally doesn't put in the solution earlier. So a good example of this is like obviously the corruption turnaround system. It might have taken a while to develop it. What about Legion Legendaries? Legion Legendaries were a problem ever since the alpha came out. Everybody predicted the problem, and it wasn't until 7.35 that it got fixed. Obviously, they made it easier to do, but ultimately you were still beholden to RNG for the entire time before then, and anybody that was trying to play an alt was basically fucked, especially if they didn't get the right items that they had wanted. Is this a fun experience for them? No, it's not. And did it take them a year and a half to come up with the idea for the Awakening Essence system? I certainly hope not, especially because people in the alpha considered that as a solution right from the beginning. And that's really what I'm trying to come at here, is that obviously I know Blizzard has to redevelop and redesign systems sometimes. That's okay. But there's a ongoing pattern here that systems are being released into the game, and then those systems are being released in an incomplete and like unwieldy and unnecessarily grindy function, and they're being released like that intentionally in order for Blizzard to later on then make them the way that they should have been, right, in terms of being like more fair and less discouraging for players later on in the patch, in order for that to be a value add for players to come back and interface with the same system that was made intentionally wrong in the first place. So I'll go ahead and let's go to another example here, and let's see. Trading Azerite gear. So this is an example that Blizzard had at the beginning of BFA. Some of you guys might have forgotten about this, but you were originally not able to trade Azerite gear. Who wanted that? No one. And I think that's really what the problem is that you have a lot of these decisions that are being made by Blizzard that are problems that Blizzard has created. These are problems that Blizzard identifies as being problems and not problems that players identify as being problems. Obviously, as game developers, they have to sometimes take the executive decision and do what's best for the game regardless of what the players think. But so often than not, it just seems like making the players grind for unnecessarily long things, and then as soon as players get done doing something, then re-incentivize doing that same activity to promote more usage and more participation metrics. And again, participation is not enjoyment. I think that for anything, it's probably resentment. So another example of this is the Legion Paragon boxes. Legion Paragon boxes didn't come out until I think 8.1. And was it 8? No, 7.1, excuse me. Could have been earlier or later than that. I don't really quite remember. But they weren't in on release. And I think one of the reasons for that is because Blizzard saw people stop doing world quests after they got exalted, and then they added another feature to continue having people do the world quests. Now, I would be generally okay with this if it was in on release, but there are many people who were farming this way past Exalted just for whatever reason, because they needed Order Hall resources or something like that, who could have been working towards those Paragon boxes right from the beginning. But I think that Blizzard intentionally withheld it because they wanted people to stop doing world quests so then they could re-incentivize them to maximize out on participation. So I'll give another example here. Titan Resident and the Azerite Vendor. So the Azerite Vendor is something, again, just like the Legion Legendaries, is something that people wanted ever since the first day that it was announced. Nobody wanted to be locked to having one randomly awarded piece of gear that you're no longer able to master loot to anybody be decided by the fickle fate of RNG, the fickle finger of RNG. And then what if you get the good one? Awesome. What if you don't? Fuck you. And that's basically what happens. And everybody wanted a vendor for Titan Resident. Everybody wanted a vendor for buying certain Azerite pieces, or at least having another chance at it. And Blizzard ignored all of that feedback for months, and they released the game in a state that was unfun and frustrating and punishing for players in an unfair way. And I think, again, it's something that Blizzard should have known was going to happen. And I think they're also doing it on purpose, because it's what makes sense if their goal is to get participation metrics. And with them saying before that the amount of subscribers they have is not necessarily indicative of the success of the game, then what is? Is the amount of store mounts they sell? Is the revenue that they sell? I think they're judging the success of the game off of participation metrics, and this is right here what we get out of that. Here's another example. Island Expedition mounts. So right from the very beginning, everybody could see that doubloons were a terrible currency that had no real functioning value at all for island expeditions and the system that was created around them. But there are all kinds of unique rewards that came out of island expeditions that, for some esoteric reason, were completely unobtainable through any other ways than RNG. Why is that? Because Blizzard wants people to play the RNG system, and then once they have enough people that get burnout on that, then they add the vendor later on. I can't think of anything that's more disrespectful and discouraging to a player than to know that you're being basically treated like, it's like, yeah, games are designed to waste your time. But back in the day, Blizzard used to at least try to hide it. I feel like they're not even hiding it. They're not even fucking hiding it. The doubloon vendor with like the random boxes where you can buy them and get the mounts out of the boxes should have been in the game on release. Anybody could have told you that. If you've tried to farm island expedition mounts before they added the doubloon vendor, holy shit, you were going to be in for a bad time. The only people that I knew that I had all of them were multi-boxing. It was crazy. You could see very clearly that this is something that's not, it's not an enjoyable process or a fun process for anyone. Let's go to the next one. Let's see. Island Expedition knows Paragon chests. PvP vendors are, again, something that we haven't really had. I don't think that's really as directly relevant, though. The cloak catch-up. So, making players do the horrific visions over and over and over is not necessarily fun or enjoyable gameplay. So, for Blizzard, in case you guys don't understand the way that people want to play alts, people want to level up alts in order to play the end game. The end game in their mind is probably Mythic Plus rating or PvP. The end game in their mind is probably not farming coalescing visions. That's not enjoyable gameplay, and it's completely unnecessary. And considering that the players already achieved that on one character and earned the power on that character, making them do it on a second character is redundant and, again, a waste of their time. So they're doing this by basically having people do like dozens of visions, and now it is slightly better, but why is it that you have to complete the entire legendary questline that takes nearly an hour on every single character for no reason? There's no functional reason for that to be the case, and it adds no gameplay and doesn't really make the game better at all. And I think there are so many of these cases where Blizzard has locked themselves into a vision or an ideology of a type of gameplay that they expect somebody to go through without actually having that be informed by what the player actually wants to do. So, for example, let's go ahead and go to the next one. Let's see here. part of Azeroth levels to unlock the same traits that you had before, because what makes you feel better than having a 355 Azerite piece with Test of Might, and then you get a 370 and it has Test of Might, but you can't unlock it because you haven't farmed enough island expeditions. This is obviously a bad system that nobody wanted, and even Battle of Dazar'alor, whenever people were thought to be able to overcome that system, Blizzard then increased the levels again because they're that disconnected from what the players actually want to see. And this is another example, I think, of, again, the disrespect that they have for the players' time. It feels like a lot of times that Blizzard is very, very quick to invalidate the amount of effort and time that somebody has put into the game by just adding in a quick catch-up mechanism or something of the sort to make everything that they've worked towards completely worthless. And this is another example of that. It's very frustrating for me to see, but at this point, it's certainly not a surprise. Let's go ahead and go to the next one here. Legion raids not having legacy loot. Why did Legion raids not have legacy loot at the beginning of BFA? Does anybody know? I don't. Blizzard's logic on it was awful. It made no sense. Why not just do it? It's not. Nobody wanted to not have legacy loot. It's not a why. It just makes no sense. So let's go to the next one. Titan Forging obviously is a large scale one. Guaranteed corruption from visions is something that people wanted on day one, and Blizzard withheld that change for a number of times, and I feel like it probably wasn't that hard to implement, that it took them that much time to develop it. And then on top of that, account-wide honor levels, cost of rerolling your Azerite gear, and of course having to do that in general, and then applying sockets to gear in general. And so I think I'm going to go ahead and just cool it with the examples here. There's a couple more, but I'm going to probably just stick with those. I think those are my strongest arguments already, is that it's very discouraging for me as a player to know that my experience and my effort is going to be invalidated a few months later once the system that I've been encouraged to participate in is then made functional for the rest of the player base that's too lazy or too uninvested to play it in the most broken way possible. This is something that's been happening, as I've said, ever since Legion, really specifically, and it's been happening slightly before then, but especially in Legion, Blizzard has focused a lot on trying to make players retrace their own footsteps and repeat the same activities over and over again by re-incentivizing the exact same content to make players do it over and over again confusing participation with fun. I'm very disappointed in this happening. I'm happy that Blizzard's added a corruption vendor, but I'm also not happy at the implementation of it, and I'm also not happy at what that implies from their philosophy and designing the game. My only hope is that in Shadowlands, Blizzard will actually start respecting the player's time and actually release these systems with a fair and balanced and equitable way to acquire their rewards without having to wait for months and months for the obvious proposed solution the moment that it's been seen on PTR to finally be implemented. I think that it's not an issue entirely of programmers not having enough time. I think that it is an issue of Blizzard intentionally withholding it in order to maximize participation from not only the hardcore players that are going to participate in the systems no matter what, but also the casual players who are waiting for the systems to become easier. And so in order to not have the hardcore players give up immediately, they make them hard at the beginning, and what I think that ends up doing is just making everybody lazy. And why are they being lazy? Because they're being rewarded for it. It's a bad system. It requires and rewards not really playing the game. And I think that it's just very, as I said, demoralizing and disrespectful to the player's time. It's happened time and time again in BFA and also Legion. And my greatest dread is that this continues in Shadowlands. Blizzard, if you're going to make a new system, make the system complete on release. Make the system fun and fair and rewarding on release. Don't withhold obvious quality of life changes for an arbitrary period of time and then finally decide to release them and then expect everybody's praise. This is not a great thing. Just give us the loot, give the players what they want, and try to work with the players instead of creating convoluted systems that nobody asked for. Pretty much it. Pretty much all I've got. Hopefully you guys agree. I'm pretty fucking pissed off about it, honestly. It really makes me worried about Shadowlands, to be honest. I'm trying to remain positive, but these kinds of things do make me worry a little bit. I'd be curious about you guys' thoughts and opinions on it. I've seen this happen a lot, and it pisses me off, and so I wanted to talk about it. Thanks a lot for watching, and hopefully we can see some sort of a change. So that's pretty much all I've got, guys. And until next time, peace.